It is good to be here this morning. It's not quite this afternoon yet. We still have lunch to go. Don't forget that one. And we're looking forward to the rest of the day. I've enjoyed the lesson so far this morning. This is the 19th annual lectureship of the Richmond Hill Lectures. And I was thinking about that just the other day. I believe you started doing these lectures, Richmond Hill, back, 95, 96? About 95 or 6. And 19 years later, we're still doing them. And it has grown in its attendance, it has grown in its knowledge. And I believe it was in 1999 that Riley started asking for manuscripts. Manuscripts by which he could take all the speakers, turn them in, and compose these books that you have every year. So I think I counted them up. There's something like 15 or so books, if you have all the years collected of those lectures. And that's a good collection. The CDs that he was just mentioning will cover a PDF file that has all those years. And you can do an index search on those years. So I would highly recommend, if you're interested in such a thing, please look and check out those CDs. It's less bulky than the books, and you can print out as many as you want as you tend toward those. So that is certainly something to at least catch up if you have missed any years on all those years. Our lesson this morning will be dealing with Romans chapter 2. Romans chapter 2. Back when you consider the findings of archaeologists, historians, and textual critics of early manuscripts that composed the New Testament. And there are thousands of manuscripts that have been discovered of the first 10 centuries or so before the printing press was invented, from which we derive the New Testament scriptures. The first century it took to compose the New Testament. It took the better part of that century to write the 27 books we call the New Testament scriptures. What's interesting is in the second and third centuries, when copies of the New Testament began to be made, they were published in codexes or booklet forms, but rarely have been discovered entire New Testaments up until the 4th century. In fact, I don't know of any entire New Testaments that existed before the 4th century. But they were published in pieces. For example, you would have what would be called the Gospels, and everything had to be handwritten, so that if someone, a Christian in the 2nd or 3rd century, wanted to start collecting the New Testament, he would look for a book that was published, and by published we don't mean printed, but rather written and then distributed to different and various parts of the Gospels. And then later you might find the Corpus de Paulus, that is the body of Paul's writings. Or it might be that you would discover, and these are the way these manuscripts are discovered too, by the way, the papyri and the parchments and the codexes. You might find the writings of Luke or the writings of John. And especially you would put all these together, and it was not until the 4th century that you begin to see an effort made to compose all of the New Testament together in the 27 books of the canon that we have. So more than likely, before the 4th century, what you would find when you're looking at the writings of Paul is you would find these manuscripts or these collections of his writings, the epistles of Paul. When you look at the book of Romans, Romans is unique and different than all of Paul's other epistles. He was either writing to individuals, such as what we call the pastoral epistles, Timothy and Titus and Philemon, or he was writing to churches, where he was addressing, say, works or churches that he had established. He might write to Ephesus. He might write to the churches of Galatia, Corinth, etc. And when he wrote to these people that he knew personally, and where he had established the churches and the works, he didn't have to explain a lot of detail because he already had a history with those people. They knew him, and he knew them. He did not have to go back and review everything that he had taught them, because he knows that they remembered those things. Well, the book of Romans was different. In chapter 1 of Romans, you see right there in verse 11, I long to see you, that I may impart unto you some spiritual gift, to the end that you may be established. Now that verse right there alone tells us that Paul wanted to give them a spiritual gift, a charismata, as the Greek would say. The reason being is because they had not yet received one, a spiritual gift in that congregation or in that place. If that is the case, then that would suggest that no apostle had visited Rome. If Rome was not established by an apostle, then they were working basically in the dark when it comes to the revelation of God. Not that they were totally ignorant. They had the Old Testament scriptures. There may have been some that had been inspired, if what Richard had suggested, and I think it's a good point, from Pentecost, those who may have been prophets or inspired men, but they did not have an apostle. You compare that to chapter 15, Romans chapter 15, and then verse 20. Listen to what Paul says. Yea, so have I strived to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest I should build upon another man's foundation. Paul had a personal rule that he followed. It wasn't something that God dictated or mandated to him. I think it was Paul's own personal favor or Paul's own personal preference. I don't want to go where the gospel is already established. As he would say in other letters, I don't want to plow in another man's field. If apostles in other areas had visited places, then I will go where no apostle has been. I will go, basically his rule was, where no churches have been established. And then we come to Rome. The church was present at Rome. And Paul was writing this letter. He had not yet taught at Rome. One of the unique differences between the letter of Romans and all of his other writings is that Paul takes time in the letter of Romans to explain in detail the gospel of Christ. We have more, I believe, of Paul's teaching, Paul's viewpoints, and what Paul would have initially started in every place he'd begun to preach the gospel in the book of Romans. You could not get that out of Ephesians, or out of Galatians, or out of Corinthians, because those letters were for the purpose of addressing particulars in problems or circumstances that those congregations were going through. But Romans is where Paul backs up and essentially starts from ground zero and explains the gospel. And that's why you have such a beautiful treatise. And so, honestly, I believe that the book of Romans is Paul's magnum opus of the Corpus de Paulus. Of all of his writings, this is the crowning epistle that explains in such magnificent detail the gospel of Christ. He starts out with the analysis of several things in the first part, and he mentions particularly that salvation is to all. It's already been mentioned, and I'm pretty sure it will be mentioned again before the day's over by every speaker before me and probably every speaker after me, that the keynote is generally thought to be chapter 1, verses 16 and 17 through 18. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. I want you to back up to verse 15 for a second and look at how he begins to develop an argument. In verse 14, he says, I am debtor both to the Greeks and barbarians, that is the Gentiles, that is the civilized Gentile world, Rome, Greece, the basic countries of the world that everybody knew was civilized. I am a debtor to the civilized Gentiles and to the barbarians, to the uncivilized peoples and tribes and ethnicities of mankind. Why is he in debt to them? What does he owe them? I would suggest to you it's basically this. Verse 1 says he was called to be an apostle. If it had not been for the Gentiles, and for the fact that God had a mission for Paul to take the gospel to the Gentiles, he may very well have been still Saul, the persecutor of the church. Oh yes. He recognized he had a great debt to the Gentiles, because had it not been for the Gentiles, he would not have been called to be an apostle. to the Gentiles. And he recognized that debt. Then in verse 15, so as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. We hear a lot of comments about the first part of verse 16, but I want you to notice that last part. To the Jew first, and also to the Greeks, to the Gentiles. Compare that to chapter 2 and verse 9. Chapter 2 and verse 9. Tribulation and anguish upon every soul of man that doeth evil, of the Jew first, and also of the Gentile. Compare that to verse 10 of chapter 2. The glory and honor and peace to every man that worketh good, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile. We see here the beginnings or the formulation of an argument. We see here an analysis that Paul is beginning to make. The gospel is for all. To the Jew first it came, and then to the Gentile. He proceeds upon that argument in chapter 1, and so we have, starting at verse 18, this problem. The wrath of God is revealed. God is angry. God's wrath is impending upon all mankind. He begins to explain why God's wrath is impending and coming upon mankind. Because we stand condemned in sin. He elaborates on all the sins of the Gentile world, but you really don't see a clear-cut picture that this is simply about the Gentiles. You would assume, before you get into chapter 2, that he's talking about all mankind, until you come to verse 32 of chapter 1. Who, knowing the judgment of God, let me back up to verse 31 so you can see this is the ending of all his enumerations of sins. Without understanding, covenant breakers, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. For years I have pondered verse 32, even before Riley made this an assignment in this year's lectureship. My question has always been, who is the who in 132? Pardon the rhyme. Who is the who referring to in 132? My best analysis would be he's probably going all the way back to verse 18. The wrath of God is revealed against all unrighteousness or ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. The thing about studying the Bible, I tell this to Hinesville, I've told it to Homerville over the years, and that is when you study the Bible, you need to pay attention to all things, and especially the little words. More often than not, the little words are more important than the big words. You'll notice three audiences from chapter 1 and chapter 2 that Paul is addressing. From verses 1 through 13, he is addressing the church at Rome. You will hear him talk about you all, ye. And he's referring to the Christians, the saints that are at Rome. He begins to switch that in verse 18, and he talks about the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness, and then he starts using the pronouns they and them. And he will do that all the way until verse 32 of chapter 1. They did this, they did that, they did not do this, they did not do that. And his wrath is impending on them. And then once again, in chapter 2, he begins to change the pronouns. And now he goes to you. But the you in chapter 2 is not the same you that he started with in verses 1 through 13 of chapter 1, where he was talking to the Christians at Rome. And I think the key to that, in understanding how that changed, is verse 32 of chapter 1. He just condemned the Gentile world for all their sins and all their ungodliness. And then he says, now God's wrath is impending on all men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. That's an odd statement too. How do the Gentiles hold the truth? How how did they hold the truth? Verse 18. Well, it would seem that the word hold there comes from the Greek word katekon, or kateketo, doesn't only carry with it the idea of holding on to something or adhering to something, but it can also mean to resist or to hinder a thing. And that would make perfect sense. All ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who are hindering, who are withholding the truth. Now imagine what little bit of light the Gentile world had. There is a God. He is singular. He hates idolatry. What little bit of light they had, they did not have the law of Moses. They did not have all the prophets and priests and the functions of the Jewish system. They were still resisting what little bit they knew. They were withholding or hindering that. And the more they hindered the truth of God, the more ignorant they became. And the sins just kept compounding upon each other. And then you have verse 32. All those who were ungodly and unrighteous, who committed such things, now those who are knowing the judgment of God, I think he just switched there, though that's a hard thing to prove. I think he's now talking about the Jews. You who know the judgment of God, that they, Gentiles, which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, you Jews, but you have pleasure in them, the Gentiles, that do them. Therefore, verse 1 of chapter 2, thou art inexcusable, O man, whosoever thou art that judgest. And so we now see a clear transition of thought from the sins of the Gentiles to a criticism and a condemnation of the Jews. I believe it's because you have here, the Jews had a judgment or a way of bigotry and prejudice that they used against the Gentile world. And Paul had to subtly address this to point the problem among the Jewish people. It was easy to point the problem to the Gentile world. Pagans and heathens, they're all in sin. But now you Jews have a problem too. And that's what begins chapter 2. I'd like for us to look at chapter 2 with two basic points. I was going to do three, but I know good and well we probably won't have time for one, let alone the two that I want to do. But there was no way we were going to get three. The first point would be an analysis of God's judgment. The second point will be an analysis of God's equanimity. And I'll explain that word if we can get time to get to it. And thirdly, which we will not have time to get through, and I did not even cover this in the manuscript, is an analysis of the use of the word law. The quality and the definiteness of the word law, whether it was singular or qualitative in its usage. And Paul does both, and that's a beautiful study. It could be a sermon in itself one day. But let's go back to point number 1. An analysis of God's judgment. He starts out in verse 1 with the vocative case. Now, the vocative case in grammar is the case of address. If you're talking to someone and you say, Brother Larry, pick that up. When I use the word Brother Larry, I can use the vocative case. I am not talking to just anybody in the audience, I'm talking to him. And so I'm calling him out by name. Well, that's exactly what Paul does in verse 1. He says, oh man. That's the vocative case. He doesn't name a particular person, but he's talking about a specific audience. Whenever the vocative case is used in the New Testament, it is always an audience pointer. You should pay attention when that case is changed, because it's a very rare case. Oftentimes it's just the nominative case. But in this particular, it's vocative, which means Paul is now acting as if he is addressing a specific person, a specific people. You are inexcusable. That's the same thing he said in chapter 1 when he was talking there in verse 20, last part, the Gentile world. He said they are without excuse. Now he says in chapter 2 and verse 1, you, O man, are without excuse. You are inexcusable. Why? Well, he explains, for wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself, for thou that judgest doest the same things. Judgment. 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 Let's talk about human judgment. There has always been and always will be until the end of time a problem, a frailty with human judgment. The Bible is very clear. Matthew 7:1, judge not that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge or meet, it shall be measured to you again. There's a warning given about judging others. And yet we still want to do that, even though the warnings are given and the prohibitions are made. And it's not just about trying to judge someone's character or to judge someone's motives. John 7, Jesus would also say, judge not according to appearance, but rather judge righteous judgment. He's not condemning the idea totally of being able to bear or look at someone's fruit and analyzing whether that is good fruit or bad fruit, whether you want to participate in this or that act. But he is saying, be careful how you judge people, and especially in their motives. You cannot know all those things. Even in courts of law, there are problems with human judgment. Over the centuries in the history of mankind, innocent people have been condemned. Guilty people have been exonerated. Because human judges cannot know everything. Perhaps the information is inadequate. Perhaps there was corruption and wickedness that would allow for briberies or favoritism. Or perhaps it's just a matter of indifference. The judge didn't care whether or not this person was guilty or innocent, and so sentenced them anyway. Or didn't sentence them as they should have been. There have always been frailties fraught with human judgment. And especially when the judgments are hypocritical. You see the problems in your other or your fellow, but you don't see the problems in yourself. That also was addressed in Matthew 7 with the mote and the beam in the eye. In verse 2 he says, we are sure that the judgment of God is according to truth. There are 4 points you can see as Paul analyzes and argues for God's judgment. His wrath is impending, and therefore a judgment is coming. Number 1, verse 2. God's judgment is according to truth. Number 2, verse 5. After thy hardness and penitent heart. That's something I will explain in a minute. Number 3, in verse 6, who will render to every man according to his deeds. And in verse 10, he talks about the honor and glory and peace. Verse 16. In the day when God shall judge the world by the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. 4 points he makes there. We will be judged by God's judgment. Number 1, according to truth. Number 2, according to our hardness of heart. Number 3, according to our deeds. And number 4, according to the gospel. 4 points are made right there as an analysis of his judgment. Let's look at the first one. God's judgment is according to truth. Paul states that as axiomatic. That's a given. We know that. He was talking as he's addressing the Jewish people here and the Christians. We know God's judgment is according to truth. When it comes to man's judgment, man can have difficulties. There can be ignorance, there can be indifference, there can be corruption. But God's judgment will always be according to truth. When you go to judgment with God, you don't have to worry about whether it's going to be a fair and a righteous judgment, because it will be fair. God's judgment will be exactly what the person deserves. So if you are sentenced to hell, then that will be what you deserve. However, God has also given a system of grace, and he will explain that in the gospel. But God's judgment will be based on truth, not ideologies, not prejudices, not bigotry. God's judgment will not be a beauty pageant, who looks better, who thinks better, who's smarter. It will be based on truth. That, my friends, can be a frightening thing. There are things that you know about you that I don't know. But it will be exposed on the day of judgment. God shall bring every secret thing with every secret work into judgment, whether it be good or bad, Ecclesiastes 12. The idea is that everything that God knows will have an exposure on that day. His judgment will be according to that which is fair and that which is impartial. It's a frightening thing. I remember one time I was called to serve on jury selection in Liberty County a few years ago. And it was going to be a pretty big trial. They brought the fellow in, and they had 40 or 50 people, us, who were sitting there, and what they were doing is they were picking out the jury. Now, they hadn't yet started anything except picking out the jurors. And they heard that this guy came in, a young fellow who committed the crime, and he watched as each person stood up and told who they were and what part of the community they were. And we went down the line. And the lawyers would say, we want this guy or we want that guy. Fortunately, I wasn't selected. I guess when they said preacher, maybe that was a flag. I don't know what it was, but I didn't get selected. But it didn't matter. Because before the end of the day, that fellow, when he saw that the jurors were going to be impartial and fair, and that he was in big trouble, he talked with his lawyers, and they pleaded the case. It never went to trial. Now, why do you suppose that would have been? I'll tell you why. When you stand before a court, and you know that the court is going to be fair, that's a scary thing when you're guilty. Number 2, God's judgment will be according to hardness. Verse 5. It doesn't fit as well in the English, but it is exactly the same grammatical structure in the Greek. According to the truth, kata ta aletheia is verse 2. Then he goes in verse 5 and says, kata, and then he talks about the hardness of heart, or hardness and impenetrable heart. Same exact structure. So literally, but after thy hardness and impenetrable heart, it could read in the Greek, it does read, but according to thy hardness and penitent heart, you're treasuring up wrath in the day of wrath. So you will be judged according to truth, and you will be judged according to your hard heart. Or, just to make the sermon flow better, we'll say you'll be judged according to the truth, and you'll be judged according to your attitude. That's something I don't think we think about often. We know that we'll be judged according to our deeds. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But to talk about the idea of being judged by our attitudes? Oh, yes. God is very clear in that there are certain things that are going to come forth on the day of judgment, even about attitudes. Your bitterness, your prejudices, your bigotry, it's going to be exposed. But I didn't do any. Well, yeah, but you had the attitude. Consider, if you will, a few verses. In Proverbs 16 through 19, we see in a personification of wisdom as God, how God feels about certain attitudes. Well, actually, this is in Proverbs 6. I forgot what I said. There's another one coming up in Proverbs 1. But in Proverbs 6, 16 through 19, he says this, these 6 things that the Lord hates, set under an abomination to him. Now listen to these. I'm not going to read all of them. A proud look. So you're not doing anything necessarily, but God hates when you have that arrogant attitude. A heart that devises wicked imaginations. That is, your heart is thinking bad things. Your heart is devising mischief. You haven't necessarily done anything, but God hates it when your heart thinks that way. He that sows discord among brethren sows discord. Well, that could be an act, or it could be a thought of bitterness. And we're reminded in Hebrews 12, where every root of bitterness springing up can trouble many. In Ecclesiastes 12:14, God shall bring every secret thing into judgment, or every secret work into judgment with every secret thing. What is that every secret thing referring to? Well, it could be referring to actions that you did in secret that nobody knew about. But it could also just as easily be talking about thoughts, feelings. In 1 Samuel 2 and 3, Hannah, the mother of Samuel, truthfully prayed this prayer. When she said, talk no more so exceeding proudly. Let not arrogancy come out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. God knows your thoughts. In 1 Corinthians 4 and 5, Paul admonishes, judge nothing before the time, until the Lord come, who will bring to light the hidden things of darkness, and will make manifest the counsels of the heart. And then shall every man have praise of God. And again, the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 4:13, neither is there any creature that is not made manifest in his sight, but all things are naked and open before the eyes of him with whom we have to do. I think This and many others that could be produced, we can show clearly. God will judge us by the truth, and He will judge us by our attitudes. We better be careful even how we think in our lives. You think virtuous thoughts, good thoughts, and get rid of those ugly hearts and hardness. And then he says how the hardness and impenetrable heart treasures up wrath. It treasures up wrath there in verse 5. When you think about treasure, treasure is something you store up as a reward for the future.